She didn't flinch when the man in the hallway looked her way. She simply closed the door, turned the lock, and let silence swallow the room. The walls of the Zhongnan Hotel were thin. But tonight, the quiet wrapped around her like a noose. So-yeon sat on the edge of the bed, her hands trembling. Not from cold, but from memory. On the bedside table lay a small digital recorder, its battery removed, its data wiped clean. She had learned long ago never to keep traces. But tonight, traces weren't the problem. The problem was what still echoed in her mind. 12 hours earlier, she had stood behind the Supreme Commander's deputy in a soundproof meeting chamber inside a government facility. 3 foreign men speaking Mandarin sat across the polished table. There had been no files, no names, no signatures. Just numbers, coordinates, casual mentions of scientists who had completed their task. The word erased was used once spoken in Korean, not Chinese. That word hadn't been meant for the foreigners. It had been meant for her. But So-yeon hadn't reacted. She never did. A translator was a wall. Her only job was to echo, not to think, not to remember. And yet, remembering was all she could do. Now, in this room lit only by the flicker of traffic lights outside, she felt her world compressing. Her passport lay in her coat, her identification still marked with the red seal of the DPRK. Her handlers believed she was asleep. Her exit was supposed to be in 48 hours. But she wouldn't last that long. Not now. Not after what she had heard. Her mind repeated a single phrase. No witnesses, no records, no survivors. She was all 3. Her name was Kim So-yeon, born in Pyongyang in 1987 to a family neither poor nor privileged. Her father was a language instructor at the Kim Chaek University of Technology. Her mother, a librarian at a state-run translation bureau. From a young age, So-yeon displayed an unnerving ability to mimic accents, retain phrases, and recall entire dialogues after hearing them just once. At 13, she was funneled into the State Language Talent Initiative, a program few knew existed. Even within the capital, selected children were removed from regular schooling, trained intensively in multiple foreign languages, and more importantly, conditioned to interpret, without judgment, without memory. By 19, she was fluent in Mandarin, Russian, English, and Arabic. But more importantly, she had learned how to be invisible. She walked without making noise, smiled without showing teeth, nodded without interrupting, and most importantly listened without reacting. These were not just social skills. They were survival mechanisms. Her superiors called her valuable. But in truth, she was a tool sharpened and stored for selective use. So, Yeon's assignments escalated quickly. She wasn't placed at embassies or cultural events like most graduates. Instead, she was appointed to a classified interministerial task force that oversaw communication between North Korea and its strategic partners. These were not governments in the formal sense, but cells, factions, and sanctioned entities, operating under layers of diplomatic shadow. Her job was not to negotiate. It was to sit in the corner of a silent room, earpiece in one ear, mouth near a microphone, and translate in real time the intentions of men who never introduced themselves. The meetings were always conducted in windowless rooms, sometimes in Pyongyang, sometimes in Dandong. Once, even in an underground facility, she was flown to blindfolded. The documents were never shown to her. The names were never spoken aloud. But she remembered every voice, every dialect tick, every pause that suggested discomfort or deceit. And still, for all the secrecy in theater, So-yeon never once believed she was in danger. She believed her role was neutral, detached, that as long as she remained silent, she was safe. Until now, despite the weight of her assignments. So-yeon's daily life was surprisingly ordinary, a carefully crafted illusion of normalcy. She lived in a modest apartment block reserved for state personnel in the Munsudong district of Pyongyang. Her unit was on the 10th floor, with reliable electricity, indoor plumbing, and a view of the Taedong River, where children often flew kites in spring. Every morning, she followed a strict routine. Wake at 5:45, walk 3 kilometers along the riverside path, return to eat a bowl of cold noodles with pickled radish, and report to the ministry building by 7:30. Her office had no nameplate, no department identifier, just a metal door that buzzed when her ID card was scanned. Inside, the space was eerily quiet. The walls were lined with soundproofing panels and rotating clocks showing Beijing, Damascus, and Tehran. There was no paperwork, no computers, just a table, a chair, and a discreet audio system that connected her to places she was never allowed to see. Colleagues came and went. No one spoke in hallways. No one exchanged names. But there were moments of strange tenderness, shared glances over a faulty headset, a slight smirk when someone mistranslated operational target as rice container. Little things that reminded her they were still human beneath the masks. Outside of work, she lived a life curated for trust. She was a member of the party's youth cultural committee, sang patriotic songs once a week, and participated in neighborhood cleanups. On Sundays, she visited her mother, now retired, who still insisted on boiling water 3 times before drinking it. They would talk about books, never politics. She was trusted enough to shop in special stores reserved for state officers, where imported goods, Chinese shampoo, Vietnamese coffee, even South Korean instant noodles were available under coded packaging. She once received a handbag rumored to have come from Singapore. She wore it only once. Too many eyes. Despite all this, So-yeon harbored no resentment toward the regime. She was not a rebel. Not even curious, really. Her role was linguistic, not ideological. She did her job with quiet precision, believing that neutrality kept her safe. The only luxury she allowed herself was a book, The Interpreter of Maladies, by Jhumpa Lahiri, smuggled in by a colleague years ago. She read it once a year, always stopping at the same line. She was the kind of person who could translate not just words, but the silence between them. She never imagined that one day, the silence would become a sentence. It was supposed to be routine. A short notice assignment came through. Interpreter required for closed-door trilateral briefing. Location: Facility 39, Sublevel 2. No context, no briefing documents. Just a sealed envelope with a time, a place, and a list of protocol behaviors. So-yeon had worked in Facility 39 before, though rarely underground. The sublevel was colder than she remembered, air-conditioned to protect equipment, she assumed. A uniformed escort led her past 3 security doors, before ushering her into a sterile white room with no windows, 1 table, and 6 chairs. At the head sat a deputy from the Supreme Guard Command, someone she had only seen in photographs. Across from him were 3 men in civilian suits, all speaking Mandarin, their accents suggesting they were not from Beijing, but Guangxi or Yunnan border provinces. There was no pleasantry, no greeting, just a brief nod, and then the exchange began. At first, it was ordinary. Financial figures, references to coordinated investments, mentions of specific zones along the Ryangang border. But then, halfway through a sentence, the tone shifted. One of the Chinese men asked something quietly. The North Korean official paused, looked briefly at So-yeon, then responded in Korean, not Mandarin. The lab at Chongjin has been vacated. All personnel were decommissioned after the final ignition. So-yeon's hands froze, her pen hovering slightly above her notes. But she kept her voice steady as she translated, echoing the sentence into polished Mandarin. Inside, something twisted. The Chinese official replied, "No survivors?" Another pause. Negative. Nothing traceable. The funding trail ends in Bishkek. Bishkek? Kyrgyzstan? She had only heard that name once before, years ago, in a different context regarding covert logistics operations linked to chemical shipments. The next hour unfolded in fragments that stripped away any illusion she still held about her role. Terms like controlled detonation, containment breach, asset liquidation floated in and out of the conversation, but no one said dead. No one said executed. They used euphemisms, but she understood every unspoken truth. She knew what had happened. A group of scientists, possibly defectors, perhaps even loyal citizens, had completed a task too sensitive to exist, and for their brilliance, they were erased. The worst part wasn't what she heard. It was how naturally they said it, as if deletion was protocol, as if truth was just another loose end to cut. When the meeting ended, she bowed as always, collected her folder, and exited the room. She didn't breathe until she reached the surface, and even then her lungs refused to relax. That night, in the privacy of her bathroom, she looked into the mirror and asked herself a question that changed everything. If I'm the only one who remembers, does that make me a witness? And if she was a witness, how long until they decided she wasn't useful anymore? Her reflection offered no answer, but something in her chest cracked open. Not a scream, not panic, just a quiet realization. I've seen too much. And they know I have. She didn't sleep that night. Instead, she lay motionless in the dark, tracing every step of her upcoming assignment, an overseas trip accompanying a trade liaison team to Shenyang, China, scheduled in 5 days. It wasn't a coincidence. She knew that now. Sending her abroad was not a reward. It was a test, a narrowing funnel, and she wouldn't wait to see what was at the other end. Over the next 3 days, So-yeon moved like a ghost, performing her duties with mechanical precision. She still translated flawlessly. She still smiled at superiors. But behind every nod was a calculation. Every hallway walk became a timing exercise. Every door an exit strategy. On the morning of departure, she packed light. One change of clothes, a sealed envelope tucked into her undergarments, coordinates, scribbled in microscopic handwriting, memorized twice, and written only for backup. She had burned the original note in her kitchen sink. At 3:12 a.m., they flew from Pyongyang to Beijing, then transferred to a regional train to Shenyang. The delegation was housed in a state-owned guest facility with perimeter security, but no armed guards inside the residential wing. She had her opening. Her contact was a former acquaintance from University Jungwon, once a fellow linguistics student, now a quiet administrative officer at the South Korean consulate in Shenyang. Years ago, they had argued about loyalty, language, and freedom. She hadn't spoken to him since. 3 months prior, he'd left a single message on a hidden server, once used by language trainees to exchange slang compilations. If ever the silence gets too loud, write me a song. She had remembered that line. And she'd finally replied, I only sing when I run. He knew what that meant. The night of her disappearance was cold. Too cold for spring. At 2:47 a.m., she slipped into the hallway, wearing the gray uniform coat issued by the hotel, blending with janitorial staff. She walked calmly to the service elevator, holding a mop bucket, and descended 2 levels to the laundry exit. Outside, a car was waiting. Not black. Not official. Just old enough to disappear. She got in. Jung-hwan didn't say hello. He only handed her a warm bottle of water and began to drive. For the next 48 hours, she remained inside a windowless room in an apartment complex housing Chinese university students. She ate plain rice, drank green tea, and wrote nothing. She didn't sleep much. Too many thoughts rattled around her skull. On the 3rd day, Jung-hwan returned. He had forged a temporary travel permit, using a stolen ID from a defunct provincial office. He told her she would leave China through the border into Laos, then into Thailand, where a network could get her to Seoul. But once you start, he said, There's no going back. Not even to memory. She nodded. The journey south was brutal. Each border crossing was a fresh gamble. Every time someone asked her name, her throat clenched. At one checkpoint near Kunming, a guard lingered too long on her photo. She feigned a coughing fit to mask her shaking hands. In Laos, a smuggler threatened to abandon her unless she paid double. Zhenghuan had given her enough money, but she knew what the man really wanted. She didn't flinch. She held a broken shard of glass in her palm and whispered, "Try it." He backed down. By the time she reached Bangkok, her feet were blistered, her back strained, and her mind cracked from sleep deprivation. But she was alive. In the safe house provided by South Korean intelligence, she was asked one question. "Do you wish to the brief?" She paused, then answered, "Not yet. I'm still deleting." Seoul was louder than she expected. Not just in sound, but in pace, in light, in the way strangers made eye contact on the street without fear. Her first memory of freedom wasn't a flag or a speech. It was the way the refrigerator hummed at 2 a.m. at Hanawan, the government-run resettlement center for defectors. In Pyongyang, appliances made noise only when electricity was available. In Seoul, they never stopped. She spent the first 2 weeks in silence, not from fear but from habit. Her mind had been trained to listen, not respond. But in Hanawan, silence wasn't protection, it was alienation. Psychologists gently encouraged her to speak. They gave her worksheets about rights and responsibilities, offered group sessions on trauma. She nodded politely, said little. Every question about her past felt like a minefield. How could she explain a life she was never meant to survive? One afternoon, she was taken to a department store as part of a reintegration exercise. The aisles stretched endlessly. Colors, sounds, options. At one point, she stood frozen in front of a toothpaste display. 37 choices, each with bright packaging, each promising perfection. She turned to the counselor and whispered, "Do I have to choose all of them?" The woman laughed softly. "Number, you just pick one." That night, she stared at the tube she'd selected. It wasn't about dental hygiene. It was about permission to want, to decide, to exist without instruction. Still, freedom came with echoes. She couldn't sleep without the lights on. Loud bangs made her body flinch. A man's voice behind her in the subway made her shoulders stiffen. Her mind replayed old dialogues involuntarily, as if her subconscious still feared misinterpretation. Some days, she felt less like a refugee and more like a recording device with no pause button. But there were cracks of sunlight. She discovered YouTube. At first, she watched only language tutorials, Spanish, German, even Swahili. But then, slowly, she drifted to videos of ordinary people eating ramen in their kitchens, laughing with friends, complaining about their bosses. She cried the first time she saw a South Korean father hug his daughter in public. In Hanawan's library, she found a Korean translated version of Interpreter of Maladies. She read it again, this time with a highlighter, circling every sentence that spoke of translation not just as a skill but a burden. Before leaving the center, each defector was asked to write a sentence about what freedom meant to them. So-yeon stared at the blank paper for hours. Finally, she wrote, "Freedom is the right to forget. Not to forgive, not to justify, but to finally let go of memories that were never hers to keep." She now lives in a modest apartment on the outskirts of Busan. Not because it's safer, though perhaps it is, but because it's quieter. Fewer people ask questions. Fewer eyes linger. She likes it that way. Her name isn't Kim So-yeon anymore. The government gave her a new identity, a new backstory, and a new birthday. But she doesn't celebrate it. She says birthdays are for children and people who have always belonged somewhere. She teaches part-time at a language institute. Her students think she's from the north, but they never ask. They're too busy memorizing grammar patterns and debating slang. And that suits her just fine. In a strange way, Teaching language again feels like regaining ownership over something that once owned her. Sometimes, at night, she dreams in Mandarin voices from that room in Facility 39. Phrases about numbers, maps, detonations. In the dream, she's always just a step away from being noticed. One wrong breath, one wrong word. Then, she wakes up, soaked in sweat, still reaching for a recorder that no longer exists. She's never spoken publicly about what she heard that day. Not because she's afraid, not anymore, but because she knows that truth without proof becomes paranoia. And she's spent enough of her life in silence to know which secrets are worth dying for and which are worth forgetting. There are days when guilt creeps in like smog. For the ones who never got out. For the scientists whose names were never spoken again. For the part of herself she had to kill just to survive. But on most days, she walks freely, buys her own toothpaste, orders coffee without rehearsing the sentence, chooses books she's not required to report. She is not healed, but she is living. And sometimes, when the sun hits the window just right, she sits at her kitchen table and whispers not for anyone to hear, just for herself. They trained me to forget, but they forgot I was trained to remember.